Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 164, I chat with Paul Hales about his approach to optimizing the audio in a room. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded June 24th, 2013. Episode 164, The Science of the Room. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by ProXPN. ProXPN is a virtual private network that allows you to use the internet in the way it should be, anonymous and unfiltered. For 20% off your new account, go to proxpn.com/twit and use the code HTG. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and Director of Content at avsforum.com. This week's guest geek is Paul Hales, founder of Professional Home Cinema, a company that specializes in speakers, amplifiers, and making them sound as good as they can in the home. Hey, Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. We got a lot to talk about. So let me first just get this out of the way. Those of you who are watching live at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv can post questions for Paul as we go, and I will pass along as many as I can. So, Paul, how did you get into the business you're currently in? Where'd you come from? How did you get interested in this whole issue of audio in the home and making it as good as it possibly can?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, it's a long story, I hate to say, but I've been designing speakers actually since I was 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
Which was about 32 years ago. So I kind of dabbled in it as a high school kid just because I was into audio and music. And then when I studied mechanical engineering in college, I kind of decided that that was my passion. I wanted to pursue that. So right after I graduated in 88, I think, something like that, 89, I think, I founded my first company, Hales Design Group. And from 89 through 2000, we manufactured very high-end two-channel audiophile kind of products. So from $1,000 a pair, stereo pair, to $10,000 roughly. Enjoyed some success there. Earned a reputation for making a pretty good sounding loudspeaker. Certainly enjoyed it, but sort of towards the late 90s, I got disillusioned with, in particular, the dynamic performance of those kinds of speakers. At the time, I had young daughters, and we live very close to Disneyland. So we would often go to Disneyland, and around the park, you can experience live unamplified music kind of everywhere. And I remember being struck by how dynamic and loud and big the sound is from unamplified real instruments. And I remember shaking my head thinking, we're not even close to that. And so towards the end of the 90s, I designed a product at Hales Design Group called the Cinema Reference, which was our first dedicated home theater speaker, which was a horn-loaded thing with a big professional 15-inch woofer and a large horn with a compression driver on it. And it was just spectacular. But it was sort of before its time. Yeah, at the time, surround sound and home theater had come from two-channel audio, and some of the sensibilities of two-channel were kind of at odds with such things as horns and professional loudspeakers. And so the market didn't really understand it. So in 2000, I was presented an opportunity to join QSC Audio, which is the largest manufacturer of professional power amplifiers in the world, actually. And they had desired to get into the loudspeaker business. So I the CEO, and he said, "What are you doing? You want to come help us get into the speaker business?" And it seemed like a perfect opportunity for me to pursue this sort of desire to get dynamic range into the loudspeakers. And I was a movie enthusiast, so I really enjoyed going to commercial cinema, and I wanted to have the opportunity to design speakers for commercial cinema. So it sounds
like the speakers that you designed, you mentioned before, with big 15-inch drivers, horn-loaded compression drivers. That sounds like what's in the commercial cinema already, isn't it?
That is true. And so that was that was in like 98. So that's after 10 years of designing sort of traditional cones and domes style audiophile speakers. And that was my first foray into that. I had spent, I think prior to that, I had gone to the Audio Engineering Society convention and listened to a bunch of professional loudspeakers. Didn't find them to sound particularly good, but liked the dynamic range they had. So that was my first attempt at, what can I do with these kind of components? And prior to that, I had only done sort of more traditional dome tweeters and cone mid-ranges and speakers that are typical to audiophile, market, like 88 dB sensitivity, 90 dB sensitivity. This new speaker was the speakers we make today are 114 dB per 1 watt sensitivity. So it's a very different world than where I was before. And so the opportunity to join QSC allowed me to pursue that sort of desire to investigate what's possible on the professional side. And so
did QSC, I don't remember ever seeing a QSC speaker on the market. I mean, QSC amps I know very well. As you said, they're the largest amp maker in the world. I even have one here in my very studio.
That's right. Google it because they sell a whole bunch of loudspeakers now. So this was in 2000. So this has been 13 years ago. They actually have a huge market in loudspeakers. I don't know that they've eclipsed JBL yet, but I think they've probably eclipsed the second tier brands. And they do a very large volume, tens of millions of dollars of loudspeakers now, actually.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. So, and I got them, I was kind of in at the ground floor. I built the original engineering team. It was all very new. They had tried to acquire a number of companies and were not successful. And so they decided to sort of build an internal team. And I was given the opportunity to help in that process. It was a great opportunity. And we developed speakers for, among other things, commercial cinema, in which, by the way, QSC has by largest the market share of the power amplifiers in commercial cinemas. So if you've seen a movie recently, that the odds are that you were listening to QSC power. We also developed speakers for permanent install, performing arts centers, restaurants, bars, auditoriums, things like that, as well as live sound, mobile concert touring venues as well. So while I was there, I learned a great deal. I got a much better handle on sort of the professional audio approach to loudspeaker design. And then in 2004, that brings us up to sort of current, where professional home cinema was my effort to sort of marry those two worlds, the sound quality and accuracy demanded by the audiophile community with the dynamic range, high output SPL characteristic of the professional audio world. And that's kind of where we've made our claim to fame, is the ability to play extremely loudly, extremely cleanly, huge dynamic range, but with sort of the timbral accuracy that audiophiles would demand. And that's sort of what... Go ahead.
I was going to say, we saw for a moment up there, and let's take a look again at the website of Professional Home Cinema, which is your current company, and you offer products there in terms of speakers. I believe you said also amplifiers.
That's right.
We had it up there for a second, and there it is.
Yeah, so there's a full range of professional style products that were developed for home theater, essentially. Loudspeakers, subwoofers, and amplifiers with built-in DSP. So it's pretty unique in the home theater world. There are a couple of competitors that do a similar kind of product. They don't really have the DSP features we have, and they don't really have the power output we have. We have some very high power amplifiers. We have one amplifier that has 4,000 watts in one 2U chassis.
4,000 watts. Is that a Class D?
Yeah, they're all Class D. That's right. All the power comes from Bang & Olufsen Ice Power. So it's all engineered by B&O in Denmark, and then we put the front end and package it together, provide the software interface.
Web Listen in the chat room is saying he had a set of Hales Audio Rev 3 speakers. Are those?
Yeah, that's a famous speaker. Yeah, that's a great speaker.
Yeah, okay. Had in the past tense sounds like maybe he doesn't anymore, and that'd be too bad.
Those up. If you know of any I can buy, let me know, because I'd like to get a pair. I have Rev 2s, but I long for Rev 3s, actually.
Okay, very good. Well, anybody in the chat room there, let me just let us know if you have any that you want to sell. You mentioned the DSP in the amps, and I wanted to touch on that a bit. What is the purpose of the DSP in these amplifiers? I mean, to me, an amplifier, generally speaking, should be kind of a straight wire with gain, right?
Right. That's a great question.
But you've got DSP in there doing something to the signal. What's it doing, and why is it in there?
Well, okay, so that's a great question. So in consumer audio, in a multi-way loudspeaker, three-way loudspeaker like the Rev 3, for instance, all the frequency dividing is done by passive electronic components. So the full range signal comes in from the power amp, and then you've got some resistors, capacitors, and inductors in there that kind of divide the frequencies up and send the low frequencies to the woofer and the middle frequencies to the mid-range, and the high frequencies to the tweeter. Well, one of the big benefits of spending time at QSC Audio was the exposure to the powers of DSP. In the professional world, most loudspeaker processing crossover functionality is achieved in DSP in between the source and the power amp. And the benefit to that is you have much, much higher resolution frequency shaping capabilities. So the ability to get a driver, have its natural response be whatever it is, and then achieve a certain target, you have much more power in the digital world than you do in the passive analog world. And so when we first founded the company, one of the stipulations or one of the founding principles was we were going to offer very high power very high power amps in conjunction with digital signal processing to handle all the speaker processing. So from the very beginning, we've always had that. We've never had passive networks. We have a couple small models, little in-wall models, where we offer passive networks just to keep the overall cost down. Because when you have DSP doing the processing, you have to have a dedicated amplifier channel for every driver in the system. So if you have a three-way speaker, you need 3 channels of power amplifiers to run that.
To run one speaker.
That's right. So in a big system, you imagine, 13 speakers in a home theater, some of which are 2 ways and some of which are 3 ways with multiple subs. You can have a lot of amplifier channels in there.
So why do your amps need such high power? You said you have one model there with 4,000 watts.
That's right. And that's also a great question.
I mean, because the way I understand it is under most conditions, you're only using, especially with speakers that, as you say, are like in the 114 dB sensitivity range. You don't need more than 1 watt to get to
114 dB, right?
Yeah, exactly. So what do you need 4,000 for?
That's a great question. So, for example, there's a thing called crest factor. Just really briefly, a audio signal has what we would call an average level. It's varying in time all the time, and it has an average level and it has a peak level. The difference between the peak level and the average level is called crest factor. And for music, for sine wave, for example, the very low crest factor signal, the crest factor is about 3 dB. For music, it's roughly taken as about 12 dB. So the average level of a song might be 90 dB. The peaks in that song, snare hits, cymbals, whatever the peaks in the dynamic content of that music, might be 12 dB more than that, or 102 dB. Movies, sort of by definition, have at least 20 dB of crest factor. And something like a gunshot has 40 dB of crest factor. So if you want to reproduce a gunshot in a movie soundtrack, and with the advent of Blu-ray, and the engineers are getting very good in Hollywood at extracting huge dynamic range out of the mixes, you need an enormous amount of power instantaneously to reproduce that dynamic signal, whether it's an explosion or a gunshot or whatever it is. And 40 dB roughly translates into 10,000 times the power. So during dialogue, you're correct. There's almost no power being used. But doing a huge passage, an earthquake, a sound effect, an explosion, a gunshot,
rocket ship taking off, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That's where that power comes into play. And without it, you simply can't do it. And our systems are known and they're famous for getting that dynamic range right. We can do startling dynamic range. Gunshots will make your eyes blink. the subwoofers make your pant legs flap and it hits you in the chest. And it's because we have all that power that we're able to do that.
So we're talking really about headroom, available headroom that you can draw upon as necessary for those big giant peaks.
Exactly right.
But you wouldn't be calling upon 4,000 watts for any length of time.
No, and for the record, that 4,000 watt amp is 4 times 1,000, and it's designed to drive 4 subwoofers. So the mid-range and tweeters don't require as much power as the subwoofers do.
Right, because of course subwoofers need to move a lot of air, and generally they need the most power, and tweeters typically need the least power, right?
That is exactly right.
Yeah, okay. Now, the main issue that I wanted to address with you today is something that everybody needs to deal with, and most people deal with it in a certain way, and you, I believe, advocate a somewhat different way to deal with it. And the problem that we're talking about is when you get a pair of speakers or a set of speakers, surround sound speakers, into a room, into an actual acoustic environment, you're going to run into problems. And how you address those problems, how you optimize the sound coming from those speakers into that particular room is a real serious problem in the industry. A lot of people use these room correction algorithms from places like Odyssey. Trinov is another one. A lot of companies make their own, like Pioneer MCACC, Yamaha YPAO, I think it's called, where you put a microphone out in the room, and the AV receiver sends a bunch of test tones, noise signals to the different speakers, and it applies all kinds of EQ.
Right.
To presumably improve the sound of the system in that room. But the reason I really wanted to have you on today was to talk about why you think that's not necessarily a good idea.
Yeah, that's a complicated situation, a complicated answer, but that's exactly right. We don't feel like EQ in that way is the right way to go. And fortunately, I'm not alone in this. There are other folks in the industry that have been doing this a lot longer than me that agree with me, namely Earl Geddes and Floyd Toole. So you can certainly look at some of the stuff they've published over the years. But that's right. There's kind of a perception, I think, in the market, particularly in the CEDIA marketplace, which is sort of where we do our business. And some of that standard practice we feel is not necessarily the best way to get the best performance. And so the features that we've included in our products actually are what we feel is sort of the best way to get the best performance out of any acoustic environment. And room-based EQ, or EQ that's based on measurements taking in situ in the room, or so fraught with error that it's sort of futile to even attempt it. And we can talk about why that is. And I hope to shine some light on this so that people can draw from both their audio experience as well as common sense, and realize maybe why some of this stuff doesn't add up towards better sound.
So let's get into it. Why you for example sent me some notes ahead of time talking about broadband room-based EQ, and which is what these other systems do. Why isn't that the preferred method in yours and others' opinion?
Okay, so let's talk about the room acoustic a little bit. So in a small room, and that's what most of these home rooms are, is they're physically small enough where we consider them or classify them as a small room. This doesn't really apply to larger venues, performing arts centers, arenas, things like that. But the frequency range, kind of the sound field, gets divided into 2 regions. And if we can look at that acoustic regions graph, there you go. So the sound field within a small room like that, in the low frequencies, is pretty much dominated by room modes or standing waves. So in most normal size rooms in North America, for example, that lower range is, we'll call it approximately 200 hertz and down. And so below 200 hertz, it's essentially a standing wave reality. And in the standing wave region, EQ can be of some benefit if used, judiciously, not excessively. Above that sort of, we call it the transition zone, 200 to 300 hertz or approximately there. And the sound field anywhere within the room is pretty much dominated by reflections, reflected sound from the loudspeakers themselves. And EQ in that region we're contesting is not advisable. And we'll hopefully I can shed some light on why we believe that, and hopefully your viewers will give it some thought and consider it. But there's first of all several sources of error in those systems, so they're not really achieving the response they think they're achieving. Second of all, human beings, we're sort of naturally inclined to adapt to our acoustic environment and kind of listen around it and listen directly to the direct sound or the source of the sound, which is why if you listen to me in this room or a different room, I kind of sound like me. Or for example, if you have a favorite high-end speaker, let's say your favorite speaker is a Wilson Watt Puppy or whatever. Wilson Watt Puppies sort of sound like Wilson Watt Puppies everywhere you hear them. They don't take on the character of the room. They sound like themselves, which is how they end up selling loudspeakers, is the consumer hears it in a store, likes the sound, buys it, takes it home, and achieves approximately a similar sound. Otherwise, if he didn't, you'd get a lot of Watt Puppies returned and he'd say, sounds like my room. So that doesn't happen. So why don't we spend some time talking about the errors in the systems that do EQ in those higher frequencies above 200 hertz, 200 to 20K.
Yep.
And we can kind of show that the curves they try to target, they're not achieving those curves anyway. Does that sound reasonable?
Sure, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay, so the biggest source of error that I'm aware of anyway is that the microphones that are used for such systems or that we use to test loudspeakers just don't pick up the sound field the same way human beings do. So the microphones, which are nearly 100% of the time omnidirectional, I don't know anybody would think of using a different pattern for measuring such a thing, basically just take all the sound arriving at the microphone from every direction, add them all together into one number. So the sound coming from the back of the room, the right side of the room, the left side of the room, the ceiling, the floor, all that stuff enters the microphone. It gets summed. And if it's trying to detect the level of 500 hertz, it just adds all that together. So, but human beings, we don't do that. First of all, we have two sensors. We have ears on either side of our head. And if you're like me, you have a huge head, huge forehead. And because the sound coming from the right, which looks like the left on the screen, can't, my head shades the higher frequencies from entering my left ear. So reverberant energy coming at me from the right wall, for example, the reflected energy, which the microphone just adds in completely. As human beings, we don't add that in. There's both a time delay to the opposite ear as well as a frequency shading due to the physical presence of my head. So,
which by the way is mathematically called the head-related transfer function.
That's exactly right.
HRTF. We've talked about that on this show before.
Okay.
But I wanted to make sure people understood that that's what we're talking about here.
Sure, and that's exactly what we're talking about here. So real quick, physical, some background on the physical reality of acoustic waves. If we take a 20 hertz very low bass frequency, the wavelength of that wave is about 50 feet long. So it's this enormous, long, slow wave that that takes forever to sort of develop. At the high frequencies, 20,000 hertz, the wavelength is about that big. So you have this enormous difference between the size of the wave of the low frequencies versus the high frequencies. And just as a sort of a reference point, a 1 kilohertz wavelength is about a foot long, about the size of our heads. So anything above approximately 1,000 hertz, our heads tend to block it from the opposing ear. So these systems which endeavor to reach a target curve using a omnidirectional microphone may indeed be hitting that curve if a microphone was listening, but human beings aren't microphones and we get a completely different response. So first of all, they're not achieving the target that they intend to achieve because we perceive a completely different answer, right? So that's just one source of error in the systems. Another source of error in the systems is um, the automated systems and even most of the manual systems, and by manual I mean a person, consultant or a technician or something that's sent out to sort of do in situ EQ by moving a microphone around and doing their own averaging and things. They don't factor in, and the automated systems are not aware of the directivity of the loudspeakers. So, for example, we believe, and I think Floyd and Earl would probably agree with this, that we tend to cue into and latch onto the direct sound from the sound source, whether it's a live instrument or a person talking or a loudspeaker playing. And if you have two loudspeakers, I think we have a graphic for this, the loudspeakers of different directivity graphic.
I think we can pull that up here in just a sec.
Okay, so for example, our loudspeakers employ high frequency horns, which do sort of two things. That's it, right? So the dotted line represents a loudspeaker with high directivity, or that focuses the energy into the listening zone, the couch there.
Right.
And then the solid line represents a wide dispersion loudspeaker, more like a traditional cones and domes kind of speaker that has a much wider dispersion and puts more energy onto the sidewalls, right?
Right.
So if you allow an automated system to measure those two speakers, the microphone is going to pick up much more high frequency energy that's reflected off the sidewalls from the wide dispersion speaker than it is from the more narrow dispersion speaker. Now, assuming that both speakers are flat on axis, and I think today in 2013 we can make a reasonable assumption that loudspeaker engineers are talented, and we're in agreement that a flat response is desirable, then that system's going to have two very different equalizations for those two products. So the narrow dispersion speaker, like ours, would have a rolling off top end, by virtue of the fact that it's just not sending as much high frequency energy to the sidewalls that reflect into the microphone. The wide dispersion speaker, on the other hand, is, so that speaker's room curve is going to have much more high frequency energy. So the automated system, which doesn't know the difference between the two loudspeakers, will attempt to achieve a target curve, whether it's a flat curve or some other shape, a X curve or whatever. And in doing so, it's going to EQ those speakers very differently. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because now the on-axis response, which if we assume was flat to begin with, will now be very different for those two loudspeakers. And I encourage people to experiment with this. If you use our speakers, which are high directivity, and you allow an automated system to correct it, it will see a wealth of bass and mid-bass energy and not a lot of treble, and it will endeavor to correct that and will suck out a lot of the mid-bass bass energy and boost the top end, and they become very strident and mid-range, forward and hard and nasty sounding. Whereas the cone and dome speaker, it will do less of that because the curve it gets from the room is different. And so the on-axis response of the two speakers now have been changed in a dramatically different way. And the direct sound out of the two speakers has been altered completely differently, even though the acoustic environment's exactly the same. And
now,
so...
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and because we believe that we tune into the direct sound primarily, all the research shows that, and if you just draw on your common sense, that is why these systems can't, in addition to the error that the microphones introduce, that's also why that these systems can never achieve a better response, because they end up moving the on-axis response away from flat, which we know to be desirable.
Right. Undermined in the chat room asked an interesting question here related to what we're talking about. Would ear-mounted setup mics help?
Yeah, and so that's a great comment. So you could get a lot closer if you had a dummy head, okay?
Right.
And they make them sort of a torso with a head and two mics that are in some ears that represent, very approximately the physical shape of a human ear. And if you took the signal from that dummy head in the listening position and you use that to capture your curve, you would then have something that's so you'd have something much closer to what a human would perceive.
By the way, those of you who are just listening, we just saw a picture of a dummy head with microphones in the supposed ears right there. And this is meant for binaural recording. If you're recording music, you can put those microphones out in the audience and get a pretty nice reproduction of what it sounds like when you're actually in the audience, as long as you're listening on headphones. But that's a separate topic. What we're talking about here is using one of those to maybe use them with an automated EQ system, and you would get some of that head-related transfer function situation going on, and perhaps more of the direct sound and less of the reflected sound, although I'm not sure about that.
Well, you would get something closer. You would measure, your curve would represent something much closer to the response that a human being would perceive, which is orders of magnitude better than the situation we have today. The challenge there is, however, and we can talk about this sort of in the next section, is if you move that dummy head around the room in each position, he'd get a different answer. And then you've got to decide, okay, which curve am I going to EQ to? Because it's going to require different EQ in every chair, and how you deal with that problem, it becomes another source of error in the systems. And furthermore, if the dummy was positioned, let's say, in the money seat, in the sweet spot, and facing straight ahead, and the person sat there and didn't move his head, then you would have a fairly good chance of EQing the system to whatever target you wanted right there. However, all the person has to do is rotate his head a little bit, sit sideways or whatever, and then all bets are off. Your answer is wrong again. So you can see it's an insanely complex situation that if we try to correct it at the level we're discussing, we can. Bob needs to sit still. Exactly. So we can.
So we're looking. By the way, we're looking at a diagram here for those of you who aren't looking at the video of a room and two people, Betty and Bob, sitting in the room and illustrating the point that you're making here, Paul, which is that if you EQ for a particular location and then you move from that location, you're going to hear something very different and probably not very good.
That's exactly right. So we'll talk about that when we start talking about EQing for low frequencies where some benefit can be had. The reality is, to give an example, let's say you measured the room response where Bob was sitting, and it doesn't matter where he was, but let's say you detected a excessive amount of 72 hertz. And in an effort to make the bass not be boomy at 72 hertz for Bob, you can add a filter in EQ to notch out some 72 hertz and reduce that excessive level for Bob. However, you have to realize that when you do that, you're reducing 72 hertz everywhere in the room. And so for other listeners, Betty or whoever else is in the room, who may have not had excessive 72 hertz, you've now reduced their level of 72 hertz, and now they have a deficiency of 72 hertz. So anybody who's made measurements in a room and looked at them will know, as you move the microphone around, you get profoundly different curves in different chairs and different positions throughout the room. And I like to say that if loudspeakers could be measured in a room and made to be sounded good by room measurements via a series of room measurements, all us loudspeaker designers would be doing that. It would be immensely cheaper. But we don't. We go way out of our way to find an anechoic environment or create a quasi-anechoic environment to take our measurements, because we realize that those ones, the anechoic measurements of the direct sound, correlate directly to perceived sound quality, and that room-based measurements are very misleading. It's very difficult to interpret much from room measurements. You could do a whole series of room measurements, and you might be able to glean a bit of information about the off-axis response of a loudspeaker, but I promise you, after doing this for 32 years, there's no way you would converge upon making a speaker sound good all the time using measurements that include the response and the reverberation of whatever room you happen to be in.
Now, F-Loop in the chat room is asking, can you widen the sweet spot for low frequencies by using multiple subs?
You absolutely can.
And then EQ would work for more listeners.
You absolutely can, and we can talk about that. That's actually a point of controversy. I'm not sure I agree with my colleagues 100% in this area. Actually, in the low frequencies, and this is a nice transition into the second topic, which is okay. I'm going to proclaim EQ above 200. If you have good loudspeakers, EQ above 200 hertz is a bad idea. It's going to move you away from accuracy and towards less good sound. So what can be done below 200 hertz? We call that the standing mode or standing wave area. And in that zone, the best approach, which is the same thing as sort of the room response above 200 hertz, is to get the room right. The best way to address room acoustics is to address the surfaces and the materials within the room and the proportions of the room and get the acoustics of the room itself right, and not to try to sort of correct after the fact the response of the system. At QSC, I stood in front of a room full of reps one time, and they had 100 reps or whatever. And one time I enunciated the sentence, no amount of EQ that you apply to my loudspeaker is going to change the acoustics of your room. And in the pro world, that's what they do day in and day out. They kind of like tune stuff up in situ and all that stuff. And first of all, people were kind of silent and didn't understand what I said. And some of them got angry at me. And I was like, but think about it. No amount of EQ you apply to a system is going to change the acoustic space. The only way to change the acoustic space is to change the acoustic space. And what we recommend is get that right in the beginning. In other words, follow some reasoned thinking, design the room, both the proportions of the room as well as the acoustic materials within the room, to make a neutral, good sounding room to begin with. But you can't change the response of an audio system, which is what these EQ schemes do. They basically just take a flat measuring audio system and make it no longer flat, and somehow affect the acoustics. It won't eliminate reflections. You can't make a reflection go away. And you can't change the standing waves. About the only thing you can do below 200 hertz is control excessive energy where there's constructive interference and too much bass. And
just let me make sure we understand this. Constructive interference is where you have a particular frequency, 72 hertz or whatever, that is reinforcing itself because of the dimensions of the room and the wavelength of that particular frequency. In those relationships, you get certain frequencies that basically reflect and interfere with each other constructively, which means they get louder. And so what you're saying is you can, in fact, turn that down with EQ.
That is correct. That was a great explanation. And you get, on the converse of that, you get other frequencies which destructively interfere, and they cancel each other. And unfortunately, There's nothing we can do about that. You can't turn up that level. Let's say you had a null at 37 hertz. You can't put more energy in at 37 hertz and, negate the cancellation. It's an acoustic cancellation. You'll just have more 37 hertz that cancels itself. Right. Now, there are some sophisticated sort of installers and integrators out there, some consultants that can do some fancy manipulation using multiple subwoofers, using time delay and EQ that can affect those modes a bit by careful placement of the woofers and the manipulation of the signal. And it can be quite effective. It really can. However, and I'm going to probably ruffle some feathers here again, but in moderation. When used to excess, we believe that you end up with a result that might be impressively smooth bass everywhere. Everybody kind of gets a similarly kind of smooth bass sound. Each chair kind of has a similar quality maybe. Particularly when you listen to steady state signals. But when you listen to real material, movies, music, it creates an unnatural sound in our opinion. And I can explain a little more about that if that's what you want to talk about now.
Well, certainly that would be an excellent topic of discussion, and I do want to get into it. But I do want to take a moment, if you'll pardon me, for just a few minutes, moments, to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is ProXPN. Now, ProXPN is a virtual private network that works with almost any internet connection to create a secure encrypted tunnel through which all of your online data passes. back and forth. It's any online application can work, and it basically keeps your internet activity private. It disguises your physical location and gives you unfettered access to any website or online service, no matter where you live or travel to. These days we hear all this talk about the NSA spying and so on. And ProXPN is actually a way to help protect yourself from anything that anybody might be watching you do online. You get complete online privacy with 512-bit encryption tunnel. It works via OpenVPN or PPTP. You get to choose. You can protect yourself against your ISP's 6 strikes rule, which certainly would be of benefit to many people. It bypasses geographical restrictions for internet content and online video, makes your internet connection region-free. And you can get software for Windows and Mac to provide advanced controls, allowing you to select the programs and ports you want to anonymously route through ProXPN's servers. It also works on iOS and Android, so you get this kind of protection on your mobile device as well. Steve Gibson of Twit's Security Now podcast gave it a great review. So certainly if he says it's good, I would believe it because he knows what he's talking about. So all you have to do is go to proxpn.com/twit for more information and to sign up. ProXPN premium accounts are normally $9.95 a month or $74.95 for the entire year, but we've got a special offer. Use the code HTG to receive 20% off for the lifetime of your account. That's less than $5 a month on the yearly plan. If you're not satisfied, you can cancel within 7 days for a full refund. So go to proxpn.com/twit and sign up with the code HTG. And we thank ProXPN very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks. Okay, now Burke, our engineer, has asked an interesting question. Couldn't we just use the old school method? Large venue, lots of speakers. Wouldn't that solve this problem as well? I'm thinking maybe not because most homes don't have a concert venue in them.
So actually, some of the clients we have actually have some enormous spaces, but in general, no. Most North American homes and other homes around the world, in fact, other countries that are smaller, the small room is a reality. And his point is well taken. In large spaces, standing waves are not so much a problem. In fact, I enjoy that here at my office. My system is in a loft area where I have a sidewall and a floor and a ceiling, but my front to back wall is 80 feet distance. So I really don't have actual standing waves that develop front to back. And so I've eliminated one of the dimensions, and the base is actually quite good, and it's easy for me. If I had a normal room that was 25 feet deep or something like that, I would then from the normal modal, the normal modes. But yeah, he also raises another important point, which is, and some of the reason why we have these room EQ schemes and why people, designers that design these rooms make them too dead, in our opinion, is there's this perception in the industry, I believe, that reflections are like evil and they're the worst things and we've got to eliminate them. And the research actually shows that's not the case. Reflections actually enhance the performance, especially in surround sound home theaters. And Floyd Toole actually did an experiment a number of years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, something like this, where they put some listeners, just normal people, in an anechoic chamber. So there was no reflections in the room, no real reflections. They put a speaker directly in front of the listener that represented the direct sound. And then they had another loudspeaker positioned off to the side, which would mimic the first reflection. So if we were in a listening room, you might imagine the reflection off the right side wall. Well, they positioned a speaker where that reflection would occur. And then they gave the listener a volume control and allowed them to adjust the loudness of that reflection from 0, no reflection at all, to loud, actually, as loud as the direct sound. And the interesting thing, and they were told to turn the knob until they liked it the best. And the interesting thing was that the listeners on a whole, ended up turning up the reflection to a level that would be louder than would occur from a hard first reflection.
From
Like
a
a
hard
brick
surface
wall.
on a wall. Yeah.
Exactly. So they actually liked the reflection, and the reason why they liked it is it made the image size of the sound larger. It made it stretched it over to the location of the second speaker, and that's something I want to point out is in two-channel audio. Unfortunately, we've been conditioned to like or expect smaller than life sound. And that's one of the reasons why I got kind of disillusioned with that arena was that dynamically the sound is much, much smaller, both sort of in a sense of physical space as well as dynamic range than real life. And going back to Disneyland analogy, I took my daughter there one day, and there is in New Orleans Square, they have a lot of jazz music, and they had a solo musician playing a tenor saxophone all by himself outside, and he happened to be standing in front of a brick building, so the brick building provided him some support. But I remember sitting there thinking, oh my God, the sound is so big and so loud and so dynamic and so at ease and so strain-free and not at all fatiguing. We're so far away from this. And that's the thing is in two-channel sort of stereo world, a lot of people expect these tight little balls of saxophone sound, and that's just not how saxophones really sound. They have this very big, open, huge quality about it. And that's something that the audiophile systems don't do correctly. And that's where reflections come into play. If we put our system into a very dead, damped room, you kind of get this sound that comes from the screen only, all the left, center, and right are behind the screen. If you put it in a room that's a little more live, where reflections aren't treated as evil, not only does the room sound more natural and is more comfortable to be in, but now we get a wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling sound coming at you, this immense sound coming at you from the front. That's much more convincing and much more real life, especially when you're watching a movie and you've got this enormous, theatrical event happening in front of you.
Well, I'm sure you've probably sat in an anechoic chamber. I have, too. What I would recommend, if anyone who is listening ever has the opportunity to do that, I would highly recommend it, just so you have this experience of being in an environment where there aren't any reflections, because that's what anechoic means. It means no reflections, no echoes. And it's a very weird sensation, I can tell you that. By not hearing anything of the room around you, it disorients you, really. It's just really weird.
It really is, and I'm glad you touched on that, because some of these rooms we go into, particularly those that are like overly engineered, and there's unfortunately more of these than I hope there would be. But while they don't approach the true anechoic quality of huge anechoic chamber, they are quite dead. And you walk and you notice that, and the first thing you notice is you start to sound like you have a cold. When you have a cold, you hear yourself in your head more than you hear yourself from your ears.
Yep.
And that's the first thing you notice, is you sound congested. And then the second thing you notice is that there's like an eerie kind of quality where your eyes are telling you there's a wall there. You can see the wall. And we, for our whole lives, have been living in an acoustic world. And like a sightless person, a blind person can kind of sense the size of a space because their hearing is so acute. Sighted people also, we know that if I've got a wall next to me, I expect subconsciously this certain amount of reverberant energy coming back to me. And when you're in a very dead space like that, your eyes are seeing a boundary there, but your ears are not picking up the reflected energy that they would expect, and it's disconcerting. And so it kind of confuses the ear, brain, eye system. And then it's also just not much fun to be in. I mean, whenever I've been in a very dead room like that and you try to just sit and have a conversation in it, you kind of just want to leave and go to a more normal space. So, we're not doing ourselves any favors by creating these spaces which are uncomfortable to be in. And unfortunately, that's all too often the reality in this industry. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is just to shine some light on some of this thinking and say, hey, wait a minute, wouldn't it be better if We did these other things because this is the result. And we put our money where our mouth is. When we do demos of our products, whether it's at CDS show or regional shows we do around the country, you can come experience exactly what we're talking about. We do these demos with no room EQ, and we produce the sound, which we can point out it's doing A, B, C, D, these qualities, and isn't that cool? So I don't know if you want to talk about more about low frequency standing waves, or if we should talk about overdamped rooms. What would you like to talk about?
Well, we've already sort of talked about overdamped rooms a little bit, and
Okay.
I do want to ask you, you are going to be at CEDIA this year?
We will. We have a sound room every year. It'll be under the name Pro Audio Technology, which is the brand name of the product. The company name is Professional Home Cinema. So it's a little confusing.
Okay.
But if
Well,
you
I'll certainly be there, and I'll want to come check it out. Absolutely.
Sure, that'd be great.
So let's talk a little bit. You were going to say some more about low frequency standing waves, and I interrupted you with an advertisement. So finish the thought there, if you would.
Okay, so there's some thinking, some research. Well, first I want to give a nod to the folks at Harman. They're doing great work. The best research in this sort of sound reproduction, particularly for the home, is coming from Harman. Floyd Toole for years, and then after him, Sean Olive and others. You know, they're researching this stuff scientifically, and they're kind of removing the opinion and the dogma and the myth and the conjecture, and they're presenting what I would call true scientific results. So I'd highly recommend any of the viewers right now, listeners, if they're interested in this stuff. Floyd Toole published a book called Sound Reproduction. I don't work for Floyd. I am not on his payroll or anything. I just think it's a fantastic book. I highly encourage them to get it because there's a lot of very valuable information in there that will help them get better performance from their systems and help them maybe become a little less confused about a lot of this sort of complex material.
I can also endorse that book without being on Floyd's payroll at all as well. In fact, Floyd was on the show, as was Sean Olive.
Right.
And I would also recommend Sean Olive's blog, which I don't remember what the URL is right now, but if you just Google Sean, S-E-A-N, Olive, O-L-I-V-E, you'll find his blog, and it's very, very useful, very informational, lots of good stuff there. So, and he has taken up Floyd's cause. He came on board Harman while Floyd was there. Floyd's now retired, but Sean is still there and doing a lot of great work. So I recommend both of those guys highly as sources of information.
Excellent advice, yeah. And I think you can follow them. I'm in some groups on LinkedIn, and they participate in those groups, and there's a lot of you can get a lot of good information from just the discussions that happen on LinkedIn. So no, very good. And so that's sort of the segue into this next topic, and I think actually Sean did most of this work, is the application of multiple subwoofers within a listening room to mitigate sort of the problems caused by standing waves. And it's all very good science. It works. It's difficult to implement. You know, it takes a really sophisticated, experienced person to sort of pull it off. It takes some sophisticated electronics. We fortunately provide those inside our amplifiers. There's, in addition to all the loudspeaker processing, there's tools for guys that do this, such as delay, and parametric EQ, that enables them to write in our amplifiers, manipulate the low frequency signals in such a way to achieve this smooth response in the room.
Now, F-Loop in the chat room, before you go on, has asked a question exactly on this topic. It says, I'm curious about the, quote, artificial sound from multiple subs with EQ and delay. I'm not sure I've come across that particular complaint. Have you?
That's a perfect segue into the anecdote I want to tell, which is what can happen when this methodology is sort of used to the extreme. So the best way for me to convey what happens is by giving you an example of a system we were involved in, and then contrast that with the way we would sort of recommend the system be deployed. So we're involved in this very large room. It's like $1 million theater. Had 8 subwoofers positioned at the floor wall junctions and the ceiling wall junctions, and a very talented, experienced guy that deployed the system that did what I would call manual system EQ. So he went in there and measured the response in all the chairs and did EQ, I believe, broadband, which was frustrating for me, but also at the low frequencies. And there's this thinking in the industry that low frequencies are omnidirectional or non-directional, and I'm actually going to defer a little bit and say that's not 100% true. I think that with steady state signals, and part of the problem in the industry is we tend to evaluate the systems with steady state signals, which really don't translate into the real material we listen to, that the clients are listening to. Nobody that I know of, certainly not our clients, we're not sitting around listening to pink noise or sine waves. And so some of the stuff that you perceive when you put a sine wave into a system, you just don't perceive when it's a transient coming and going signal. So the long and short of it, what happened is this guy worked very hard to do this phase manipulation and multiple subwoofer setup to achieve, I think the goal was the most similar response in every chair. And while I didn't measure the response in every chair, I can assume from the sound that he got that it was probably a lot more uniform from seat to seat than when he started. However, any sensation any perception whatsoever of directional sound of the low frequencies was gone. So this was extremely dead space too. So instead of being enveloped in sound, the surround sound kind of being all around you, it sounded like the sound was coming from the surfaces of the room. You weren't sitting in it. It was coming at you from the surfaces, as was the bass. And I was watching the screen in front of me, and I was watching a rock concert, and we're kind of famous for this drum solo, Ginger Baker drum solo. And so I put on the drum solo, and the kick drum, which I'm used to sort of hitting me in the chest from the front, because that's where the band is. When I go to a rock concert, the sound comes at me and kind of punches me in the chest from the front, which is low frequency directional information. The concussive part of the low frequencies wasn't there. And so there was no visceral sensation of the bass whatsoever. It was just kind of everywhere and nowhere, except for it vibrated my chair. And so I saw the rock band on the screen, and the only physical sensation of the bass of the kick drum that I got was a vibration in my butt. And so I said, I kind of jokingly said, get the kick drum out of my butt. It's supposed to be coming from where the drum set is, right? And so I think used to the extreme, you do get an unnatural perspective. The bass becomes unnatural because it's now no longer tied to the pitcher. And your eyeballs are telling you, I see the drum set over there. I expect the sound of the kick drum to be coming from where I see it. And in that way, while it might be impressive that, everybody's chair sounds exactly the same, the guy's doing it, he's going like this and listening over here. And I'm like, well, first of all, our clients tend to not do that. They don't bob their head back and forth. And second of all, we do these demos all around the world. And we might have the CD rooms are not that great, right? These are these little temporary rooms, and we don't have any control over the dimensional ratios or anything. And we've never done a demo where you got 25 people sitting in 25 seats, and like half of them jumped up and said, that was awesome. And the other half said, oh, it sucked. It just doesn't, with real signal, everybody gets pretty much the same experience. If we put on that same cut or a similar or a movie, and you polled the people around the room, I don't think you'd ever get a situation where some chairs said the bass sucked and the other chairs said the bass was awesome. And why is that? Because we're not listening to sine waves. The bass comes and goes. If you have a footfall of a dinosaur or you have an explosion, it's in and it's out. The standing wave doesn't have time to develop. And
good point.
And high Q resonances, right? I once got into a fairly heated debate with a very high-paid consultant, very knowledgeable guy. I've known him for years. He's like, "Oh, damn it, Paul! I measured 40 dB difference, from chair to chair at whatever frequency." And I'm like, "Okay, well, we'll call this person Sally for lack of a better name, or we'll call her, what was it, Bob and Betty? We'll call it Betty.
Betty, there you go.
I was like, well, let's at least agree. Okay, if it's 40 dB difference, then let's agree that that's a very high Q phenomenon, right? By definition, you can't have a low Q 40 dB phenomenon because, right? Anybody who knows engineering will understand that if it's different in level.
Let's quickly define Q just in a general term.
Sure. So it's sort of describes how peaky a resonance is. So a broad, low, resonance is very wide, and frequency would be a very low Q phenomenon. Anything that has a very high amplitude and a very narrow bandwidth, so just a few frequency, few hertz wide, but a very high Q, that would be, or very high amplitude. That would be high Q. So if it's 40 dB, it has to be high Q. And so my point to him was like, okay, you can spend all this money on the multi-channel EQ and the consulting fees and all that stuff to chase down that 40 dB peak at 62.5 hertz, right?
Right.
What percentage of the time will real content, real signal, energize that very high Q resonance? And the answer is, in order to energize a very high Q phenomenon like that, you have to have concentrated energy right at that exact frequency, right at 62 hertz, for enough period of time to build up that energy. And the reality is, if you're watching a romantic comedy with your wife, that'll never happen. There'll never be 62 hertz in there. So the percentage of time that you could ever excite such a high Q phenomenon would be practically zero. So just because we can measure it doesn't mean it's a problem. And I think that that's where a lot of this sort of energy that is a little misguided results from. And Floyd points this out, very eloquently in his book. Is he states it's something like, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like, our problems with rooms kind of started when we started measuring them in them. Because whenever you look at a graph measured in a room, it looks horrible. Yeah, my speakers measure very flat, and they look awesome in an anechoic situation. You put them in any environment, and you measure them, including the room response, and it's going to look god-awful. And so I think that the people who saw these curves, their eyeballs went, oh, my God, this looks horrible. We can't possibly like that. And then they try to fix it. And that's where we got off course. Our ears don't hear that curve that's on the screen. Our ears hear the anechoic curve. And it's not that the room response doesn't play a role. Of course it does. But it's a minor, secondary role. And we cue into to that direct sound, which is what we want to preserve and keep as flat as possible.
Very good. Web 5766 in the chat room is asking, room design for vocal versus music. Any difference?
That's a good question. A little bit outside of my area of expertise, probably an acoustician, somebody that designs concert halls, things like that. I can say that, speech intelligibility is different than singing. Concert halls that are designed for music, reflections are a good thing. That's exactly what they do, is they manipulate the reflections so that the sound makes it to the audience and so that the performers can hear themselves. And so, in that case, and Floyd points this out too, is, there's some concern about comb filters resulting from reflections. Well, as Floyd correctly points out, a concert hall can be described as a, huge comb filter generator. It just generates huge number of reflections, and they're a good thing. They get the sound of the music to the listener. They make a big open sound. They're why when you go see an orchestra, the orchestra sounds big and open, and a lot of the sound comes from above the orchestra. This is why orchestra pits work, is normally if you put something in a pit, you wouldn't think you'd be able to hear it, but the sound kind of rises above and reflects off of the surfaces of the acoustic environment. So different objectives for music and then voice, speech intelligibility. And in that case, sound consultants and engineers shoot for as high a ratio of direct sound versus reflected sound. So there are some cases where reflections enhance intelligibility, but for the most part, you want to put the speakers close to the listener and get the sound directly to them so that the consonants and the speech can be interpreted, as unfettered by reflections as possible. Echoes, where a reflection arrives, 30, 40 milliseconds after the initial sound, they can be problematic for intelligibility. So kind of two different things. And
Right, but
I don't want to talk about that anymore. It's really sort of outside of my zone.
okay, that's fine. Certainly, though, the point you make about you want the speakers to be relatively close to the listener is not going to be a problem in most home theaters, because as we said earlier, those rooms are relatively small, and you're going to have the speakers close enough to you where, unless you muck up the sound with room EQ, it's probably going to work just fine.
And that's right. And that's kind of where our systems become very easy to deploy. We have higher directivity, so more of the sound is going to the listening area than in a traditional loudspeaker normally. And then because the rooms tend to be sort of physically small, acoustically speaking, almost everybody's sitting in the direct sound of all the speakers, particularly the surround speakers. So what you get from that is a system that's really easy to deploy. If you take a room acoustic, which I will describe as like the typical North American living room, so you've got some absorbent material on the floor, whether it's an area rug or carpet. You've got some soft furniture. You've got a few people in there. People are actually very good absorbers of sound. And then you've got some things on the walls, furniture, not flat surfaces, bookcases, things to diffuse the reflections from the surfaces of the walls, and maybe some draperies and some other soft materials. That's a pretty good start right there. So it's kind of fortunate for us that what is sort of our preferred aesthetic happens to be acoustically very good. And think about it. How do you sound when you're having a conversation in your own living room? And it sounds pretty good. I mean, it sounds pretty neutral. It doesn't sound sucked out. It doesn't sound too live. Unless you have a very modern design where everything's hard, it probably sounds pretty good. And that's an acoustic that, if you use that similar sort of balance in a home theater, particularly with speakers like ours where the directivity is high, you get a fantastic result. You get fantastic dynamic range, articulation, and the reflections that are present enhance the envelopment or spaciousness of it. So the front sound goes wall to wall, floor to ceiling, and rather than just hearing sounds coming from the sides and back, you're actually sitting in it. You know, if we play a live concert piece where you hear the sound of the audience, when the room is optimized, you're not just hearing the sound of audience coming at you from the wall surfaces. It sounds like you're sitting in the audience and the people are all around you. And it's a very convincing effect and much more believable than an overly engineered room where you get this unnatural effect like that whole bass drum in your butt thing.
Well, with that, I'm going to have to terminate our fabulous conversation here.
Moral to the story is keep the kick drum out of your butt. That is
keep the kick drum out of your butt. I will take that as the moral of the story. Indeed.
All right, great.
I thank you so much, Paul Hales, for being here, and fascinating hour of discussion about room acoustics and keeping the bass out of your butt.
Exactly. Good thing I'm going to go down in history known for that phrase.
For that phrase, I think you should trademark it. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You can read about Paul's products and philosophy and everything else at his website, professionalhomecinema.com. You can find me, of course, on avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv, and you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott. You can also find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here at twit.tv/htg, and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit-hometheatergeeks. Next week is going to be a special episode of Home Theater Geeks. I will be recording at the CE Week event in New York City, which is sort of a mini CES. And I'll be talking with a bunch of different manufacturers who are going to have displays there showing all their latest stuff. I'll also be moderating a panel on UHD, ultra high definition, this new pseudo 4K standard for the home, which is the hot topic these days. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking to manufacturers about their latest product, all coming to you from New York. So I do hope you will join me and my crew for that. Until then, geek out.